And your speech was based on not only research, but practice. Now you said that you can see why we still maintain and consider, why we consider that we are confronting our difficult past for a better future. Because as you said, our past were alienated, marginalized, and separated. So we still consider it to be a difficult past. And the TRC, we do have committees. We have more committees than the South African committee, because we have a committee on religion and traditional affairs. And Shikafuma Komne succeeded, he on that committee too. And we have been through all our process from the awareness stage. We have been also engaging our traditional leaders in every process of our state. So we hope that through reparation, we will restore our broken relationship with our ancestors. Thank you. We will now hear from Teresa Elmer, who will be speaking on healing and memory, right? Can you just let us know a little bit about yourself? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and warm greetings to the commissioners, to the people of Liberia, and to others who've gathered here, especially for this event today. My name is Teresa Edelman. I come from South Africa, about 900 kilometers up the coast from Shirley, who spoke yesterday, about halfway between Cape Town and Durban. Not many people go there, but it is famous because it is close to the grave site and the birthplace of Stephen Bantu Biko, and because it's about 4 hours drive from the birthplace of that great South African, Nelson Mandela. I come here, yesterday you introduced us as experts, and I need to say I come here very humbly today. I do not feel that I'm an expert. I come here as a daughter of colonialism in Africa, and somebody who has dedicated her life, I was looking at your slogan on your banner, to confronting the difficulties of our past within South Africa and working towards building a better future in that context. And so I bring you a story and some insights and some accounts about the work that I do in the hope that they can in some small way contribute to the important work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in this country. The context that I come from is an organization called Spirals that began after the work of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And it was very much a local initiative that was set up to continue the healing work that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa began. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about healing and memory very broadly as I highlight some of the issues that have emerged during the 10 years roughly of the work of Spirals. One of the things we've realized is that a huge challenge for any Truth and Reconciliation Commission is to find a balance between the work of the legal process and the work of healing. That as the space has been set up, there are very strong legal components to any Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But the very word reconciliation, as my colleague Lutu was saying earlier, is strongly linked to processes of healing. And that is a very complex place that you sit in, because the healing processes that are needed are both political as well as social and personal. And so to be working at so many levels at any one time is just about impossible. And to be working under the constraints that you are working only adds to that pressure. Why I would like to speak about the work of Spirals is that it was a grassroots initiative. And I think that might open some doors in terms of looking at broader processes within Liberian society that could support the work that you are doing. I'd like to talk a little bit about memory in the context of violent conflict. Because when there has been interpersonal, communal, or national violent conflict, it means that the identities of individuals and of the nation as a whole are profoundly shaped by trauma. And I hear this word, people have been traumatized, used a lot, but I'm not sure that we actually stop to understand what the nature of trauma is and how profoundly it shapes our identities. And when I say identity, I mean how profoundly it shapes the way we understand ourselves in the world, but also how we understand each other, picking up on the same issue of interdependency that Lutu was speaking about earlier. In terms of the work that we've been doing, the most useful understanding of trauma that we have found is that somebody is traumatized when something happens to them that strips them of the ability to stop this terrible thing from happening. It strips them of a voice to speak and to give names to these things that are being done to them. The impact of trauma is that it cuts to the very heart of how a person or a family or a community used to understand the world to be. The things that used to make the world a safe place, a place of positive meaning, a place in which life could flourish. For many people, the result of trauma is that the world becomes a frightening place, a hostile place in some way, where simple moments of interaction can remind one of those terrifying moments of being so overwhelmed and in so much pain. And one of the hardest things when one is living through the consequences of a trauma is to name what happened, to describe it, because somehow in the way in which we live with trauma, there's a feeling of guilt and shame associated with having been so overwhelmed by what happened. Why couldn't I stop it? Why didn't God help me in that moment of absolute horror? And so when we're living in a society that has experienced the levels of trauma that the context in which I come from, South Africa, but even more so, it seems to me, in Liberia, we need to understand that every person sitting in this room, every person who is even sitting behind the commissioners' desks, who sits behind these tables, who stands where I'm standing, every person knows what it is like to go to those kinds of places. And that is part of our identities. I would argue that for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to do the work that it needs to do, and for a national healing process to go where it needs to go, those kinds of issues need to be acknowledged. Not because we want to add to the burdens and to the shame of what people are living with, but because we need to affirm the courage and the strength and the resilience that it has taken to survive. We need to find ways to give honor to those who died and whose blood has been spilled on our soil, and to build a society where these things won't happen again. And so those are the kinds of memories that I would like to focus on particularly, because we're dealing with memories in which people have felt stripped of dignity and humanity and the power to act or to protect. We're dealing with memories that don't have a voice often. And we're dealing often with people who are feeling stuck and paralyzed in those places of pain. And so the healing that a TRC process and other parallel processes needs to bring needs to work at those kinds of levels, as well as at levels of broader social issues and political issues. Our argument within Spirals is that none of these processes is independent of each other. Any sustainable democracy needs to work at a level of grassroots healing in order to be sustainable. Any legal process of reparations will not be sustainable if it's not accompanied by a process of people finding healing and finding peace in order to be able to claim that new identity that Shirley was speaking about yesterday of being human rights activists. And when we're talking about these traumas in the context of the so-called developing world, or the two-thirds world, as I like to call it, we need to acknowledge two things. In the West, the original definitions of trauma in terms of the psychological and psychiatric textbooks, they define trauma as an experience outside of the realm of normal human experience. What those of us working in the two-thirds world are saying is, hold on, sorry, trauma is the norm in the contexts where we are living. We need to understand that most people do not deal with one experience of trauma in their lives. They deal with many. And any healing process needs to understand that. The other thing we need to recognize is that dealing with pain and trauma is as old as the story of human beings. A Truth and Reconciliation Commission is a new model to do that. Western psychology is a new model to deal with very old issues. And so the more we in our contexts can understand and explore ways that integrate the kinds of healing processes that Lutu was speaking about, as well as the wisdom that our religions and Western psychology can bring us, our argument is the more sustainable a healing process will be. The overwhelming reality for a TRC, though, is that you cannot do this. And so I think I've been invited here with a mandate to argue for an initiation in any proposals that you make of grassroots initiatives that draw on the wisdom and experience of people who've lived through these times, have come through these times, and can become leaders and elders and activists in ongoing healing processes that need to last way beyond the life of this Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Because the very fact of having survived these conflicts, the very fact that you as a society have reached the point of having a democratically elected president, having a legislature that can set up a process like this, having the courage to create this kind of space where truths that have been hidden before can begin to surface, means that there's a lot of strength to draw on. And so we can either look at it as being, at home we often talk about, is your glass half empty or is your glass half full? So do we say, we've been through terrible times, we're feeling weak, we're feeling helpless, we're feeling overwhelmed? Or do we say, we've been through terrible times, but we've come through it. Look how far we've come. Let us put resources and initiatives in place that can build on that and that can appropriately honor those who've gone before us. And so I would argue in support of speakers yesterday that it is a very dangerous thing to impose identities of victimhood or of perpetratorhood onto people, because it tends to become a box, ultimately, that limits the possibilities in a situation. And it tends to develop a culture of mutual exclusion, that perpetrators and victims somehow belong to separate categories of identity. Whereas actually, in many ways, a perpetrator and a victim have an intense relationship that is unlike any other. And each needs the other in order to find sustainable healing. For somebody who is both a victim and a perpetrator, and I want to support people who are raising this issue because it seems to be an issue in many contexts in Africa at the moment, that process of healing those polarized identities needs to be allowed to happen within that person's heart somehow. I think we're struggling to find ways to do that, but I think your country and your commission provides wonderful opportunities to do that. It's also, in terms of our understanding of trauma as having silenced the voices of suffering because of that shame and guilt, that we were not strong enough to stop these terrible things from happening, an important part of the work of healing and of a commission such as this is to proactively invite the silenced voices, the people whose pain is invisible in some way. And sometimes that involves a lot of risk. It might be people who are unpopular in some way. It might involve a lot of resources to go to remote areas and to find people and to work with them in a way that enables their voices to be heard. But it is an important part of the process, because as history teaches us, when people feel victimized or alienated or marginalized, that is going to come back to haunt them, and is going to come back to haunt the community and the society that they belong to. Within Spirals, we've drawn on the very ancient tradition of stories in finding methods that can enable this kind of healing. And the stories are largely about where have we come from? Why are we where we find ourselves today? Let's listen to that deeply. Let's think about that deeply. And let's look at the choices that we are facing. Is the way that we are living today in our community, in our household, in our nation, is that going to take us where we want to go? And if not, what do we need to do to find ways forward that enable us to realize the visions that have brought us together for this process? And so that's a very simple mechanism. It is as old as I said, as old as humanity itself. And my understanding is that you have a rich tradition of that within Liberia, in your tradition of the Palaver Hut, where the community gathers to talk through something that has happened, to listen to the stories of different voices, and to decide on a way forward. I was interested to see in the Amnesty International report about this TRC that they highlight exactly this tension of, is this process a Palaver Hut, or is it something more structured and more legal? I think I'm here to argue for the Palaver Hut part of the tension, because it seems to me that we are crying out for people to gather and to find places of tension and pain that enable us to identify the important choices that will take this community and this society forward. Some of those places of pain and tension seem to revolve around gender in some way, that there's a tension around the place of women and children in this process, as you highlighted yesterday with your question. But in terms of the work that we've done in Spirals, I would argue that the issue of why men are the way men are is as important to explore. Why are masculinities constructed within the society that violence is a desirable option? Where are the elders and the role players who can provide the young men of this nation with another kind of option, with choices, and help them to make choices that will build this nation, rather than leave them marginalized and vulnerable and filled with shame and guilt for those who were caught up with the violence? Is there a way that those young men's pain can become as much part of the healing process as the ways in which women and children need to be heard? It's a difficult journey, because part of the identity of a man is to cope and not to need to speak these truths. I don't know the tradition of the Palaver Hut enough, but I wonder if there are ways for these stories to be surfaced, because my heart tells me they are important in the healing process of this nation. I think my time is nearly up. There's so much to say, it's very difficult. But in terms of healing and memory, it seems to me that a process such as this is building the memories of the future. That a commission is about understanding the memories of the past, recognizing and affirming those who have suffered and who have lost, and bringing restoration. And that restoration needs to happen at a political level. That restoration needs to happen at a material level as much as possible. But that those kinds of restoration are not possible without a psychological, communal, and spiritual process of restoration as well. Because a sustainable democracy depends on people feeling like they belong in the system, that they have a voice within the system, that their human beingness, their dignity as well as their rights are recognized by their community and by their nation. And until we set up processes that shift the historical paralysis of the memories of the past, it is going to be very difficult for us to create more positive memories for the future generations. So I think I'm going to leave it there and suggest that we have further discussions and engagements during the question time. Thank you very much.
I want to thank Mr. for speaking on healing and memory and the challenges that we find working through the legal process and healing, especially when we have healing. The healing process must be not only political but also social.